Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Roper with WMAR2 News, and today we're talking about vaccines, the vaccine against the coronavirus, and we are joined with Dr. Theodore Bailey. He is the Chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases at GBMC. Good morning, Dr. Bailey.
Good morning, Mark.
So there are a lot of things that people want to know about the vaccines, especially every day it seems like you're reading a new headline, and sometimes those headlines seem to contradict what you read the day before. I know just this morning I saw a few headlines that seem to be of interest that people are wondering, or there are reports that one shot may be different than another. And obviously we have two vaccines right now, Moderna and Pfizer, possibly the Johnson & Johnson coming along the way. What do people do or think about when the fact that I want to get vaccinated and right now there are two choices and then potentially a third?
Well, one of the things is I would say that if you have access to the vaccine, getting vaccinated sooner rather than later would be the priority. So I wouldn't stand, I'm going to wait, allow myself to be unvaccinated for a period of time to hold out for a future vaccine or another vaccine. So I think that the margins between them are fairly subtle, that it's most important thing would be to become vaccinated. And when we think about what we did in the last year, we saw very large scale studies done at really amazing paces. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people enrolled in the studies. We were able to demonstrate very high protective levels, but the level of detail that kind of a study can generate is not great. It generated very large scale data that this is an incredibly protective set of vaccines. But in terms of we're going to continue to get in more fine grained detail over time, because that kind of detail does take time to accumulate. But the big picture that is highly protective, and then we're talking about 90% plus protective, is well confirmed, and that's the most important thing.
And one of the things that I've wondered is that we've heard with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that it might be not as effective as the other two. And I know when you go get vaccinated, it's not like you have a choice where you can say, I want this one, I want that one. But should there be some maybe thought given to the fact that people who might be less at risk should be given the vaccine that might not be as effective? Like, would there be a benefit to thinking about who is given which vaccine?
You'd have to feel confident that to engage in that process is not going to lead to delays. The differences that we're seeing are fairly subtle, and there may be internal differences between the study populations in one and the other that have not yet been parsed out. So, we may see that there was more exposure, more risk in a vaccine study that demonstrated smaller numbers. So for me, I would not hold out for this or that vaccine in particular.
And now that we know a vaccine is here, some people might think that there's no reason to really get tested. I'll just get the vaccine. Should people still be thinking about getting tested?
Yeah, they should. And this goes to the level, what we were able to demonstrate. We were able to demonstrate really one of the two most important things, but only one of the two most important things. We were able to demonstrate that it made an incredible impact on the likelihood that a vaccinated person would become ill with COVID. That is to say, actually have symptoms, be sick, or even potentially very sick. And we saw that it really dropped those numbers dramatically. But what wasn't studied within the initial vaccine studies, and we're starting to see it studied in the new ones that are being run, was whether it impacted your ability to acquire the virus and then to transmit it to somebody else. And because we don't know really the impact on those two factors, we really would still approach this as something that people should get tested if they've been exposed. They should treat themselves as somebody who could potentially pick up, carry, and transmit the virus even if they've been vaccinated. So they should still exercise all the same kinds of caution that they did before. It's just to protect them more from the very severe illness that COVID can cause.
And some people have concerns about getting the vaccine, especially someone who might have pre-existing allergies. Sometimes there are concerns about if I have allergies, whether it's to seafood or to certain food products or bees or what have you. What concerns should those people have in terms of getting vaccinated?
Well, so they need to become very clear about and talk to their doctor. What was I allergic to? Do we know what I was allergic to? Which vaccine? What composition? And then actually those people do need to know the details of the particular vaccine that's being contemplated for them. And you really want to sort of make sure that there is a match between those, that the possibly concerning ingredients of what they had a reaction to are not present in what they're looking at as a possible vaccine for them.
And we have a question right now from John Martin. We've heard a lot about the different variants that are now out there with the coronavirus. And he's asking, what's being done about the next strain? These vaccines will be worthless very soon. I doubt they will even give these vaccines out before the next strain.
So, I mean, one part of this is to recognize that the appearance of the new strains should not eliminate the older strains. These strains are not truly in competition with each other. There's been a very small percentage of the human population, if you can believe it, that have actually become infected. So there's a very vast number of people who are still vulnerable to COVID infection, who do not have natural immunity from having been infected and who are not yet vaccinated. And because of that, there's plenty of human beings for each of the strains to infect. And they're not going to be truly, there's going to be small levels of competition, but there's really so many possible potential vulnerable people that we're going to see the older strains persist for a good long time. And so there will be no consolation to passing on the vaccine and becoming infected with the older strains. So I would still get vaccinated at this point. The new strains, and even strains that we haven't heard from yet, may develop some mutations that decrease the level of protection. But the other part of protection is also that it's not, again, it's protecting you against the illness. And we don't yet have a measurement for how much it's going to impact these other strains. We don't believe it to be entirely worthless, and for a lot of the strains, it will be still highly protective. So these vaccines will still be of inestimable value. But it does point to the need to continue to research the new strains and I think an ongoing development of new vaccines, just as we do for flu each year, where we're constantly generating new vaccines. That process should be ongoing. It's not something where we should rest on our laurels, say we have these great vaccines and we're done with our research process. And the good news is we're not seeing that. We are seeing multiple research entities engage in clinical trials of vaccines. So we should be seeing basically a pipeline of vaccine development ongoing.
And one unusual thing about that, I saw a headline about in the UK how they're doing research on mixing vaccines as one way to kind of combat the variants.
Well, and that makes a fair amount of sense, because that's actually a strategy that's already used. We use that with flu. So when you get a flu vaccine, you're not getting a flu vaccine. You're actually getting technically several vaccines in one against multiple strains of influenza. So the idea that for mutating viruses or viruses with multiple strains, that you might need several vaccines to provide yourself the adequate level of protection is recognized as a strategy, and we're trying to research into that for COVID, because it likely will be better than a single vaccine. But that doesn't mean that a single vaccine isn't highly important at this point in time.
Some people wonder what happens if they do get a reaction when they go, they're set for an appointment, they're ready to get their shot, but before they go, they might wonder, what happens if I do have some sort of reaction? Then what do I do?
Well, it would depend on what the reaction is. I mean, so if we are seeing a fair amount of sort of local muscle pain at the site, and then we're also seeing kind of generalized body aches, faintness, lightheadedness. This seems to be worse with the second injections rather than the first, probably because the immune system has been primed. What I would say is rest, maintain fluids. Now, if there is a more severe thing where we're talking about, airway, you're starting to feel like you're short of breath, having trouble breathing, this is the kind of thing where you would want to be seen urgently, because like other vaccines, that's a possibility. Not one frequently seen, but if you have symptoms of shortness of breath, you feel like you're working hard to breathe, being seen in an urgent care or an emergency room would be the relevant step to take.
Because I know that health directors have told me when you do get the shot that they have you wait around for 15 or 20 minutes just to see if you have a reaction. But is that even enough time for the vaccine to work itself through the body to even tell if there would be some sort of reaction?
Yeah, so the most concerning kind of reaction is what we call an immediate type hypersensitivity reaction. And that is one where you already have antibodies that are of an allergic type. They're not the antibodies that we want for vaccine protection. They're actually antibodies that are really linked to allergic reactions. They're called IgE. And if those are already existing and in place, which is what you would need for this kind of severe reaction, then it will take just a matter of several minutes before you would start to experience those symptoms. So that's a fairly standard duration that we would wait for other kinds of vaccines as well, to make sure that people aren't having reactions to them.
A couple other questions that people have sent to the station that people are wondering about the vaccine is, do I need to save the card that says that they've been vaccinated, and what should they do if they lose it?
What to do if
How
they lose?
about,
Well, it would depend on where they got the card. I mean, what I would say is, as you're getting your vaccine at whatever facility you happen to be getting it at, is to talk to them about what their protocol is for replacing lost cards. It will likely differ from institution to institution, but it is worth finding out ahead of time, and it is worth holding on to it. As we think about strategies of reopening society, one of the things that's been talked about, and I think because it's a possibility, we should prepare for it, is the idea of a so-called immunity passport. And so it may be relevant to demonstrate that you have had a vaccine to have access to certain amenities or to more travel. Now that's not happened. It may never happen, but you should build the ark before the flood, and you should keep the card in case it does become relevant to certain policies. And that's how I would look at it.
what have you heard about the new vaccines that are on the horizon? Johnson and Johnson, and now AstraZeneca.
Well, so they are studying AstraZeneca, for instance. They are doing data on, is this actually preventing viral shedding, or is this preventing transmission? So we are seeing kind of a broadening of their assessment to not just does it prevent disease, but is it going to also prevent transmission? And that's the kind of data that as it comes out, and these are trials that are ongoing. Even the trials that we have already announced, is 95% protective. These are still trials that enrolled so many people that we are still watching their immunity, because the other thing we need to know still is how long is that protective effect present? What they did is what was called an interim analysis, which is after a certain amount of illnesses arose within the initial trials, then they lifted the lid to see, well, who got ill? Was it the people in the placebo? Was it the people in the vaccine? And they saw a dramatic difference that most of the infections, the very vast majority, were in the placebo, the folks who did not receive a true vaccine. But that was only 200 infections out of something like 30-some thousand volunteers in those trials. So those people are still out in the world and potentially exposed to COVID, and it's still of interest whether or not we're still seeing differences in the rates of infection. So even the older trials are not done. They were studied at an interim or intermediate point, and it was found to already demonstrate, very strong protective effect at that point in time. So old ones are still going on, new ones are still being conducted, and they are broadening the points of analysis. So they are looking at more than just preventing illness, but preventing disease transmission.
So that's a benefit of the AstraZeneca vaccine, that it would prevent transmission over
it appears to be, and now we just don't know with the Moderna, the Pfizer. We just don't know. It's not that we studied it and know that it doesn't do it. It may do it, but we don't know, and it's an important thing to know, because part of getting the vaccine, when we think about getting vaccines, is to protect ourselves. But one of the things that would really light a fire to get it is, can we be protecting other people? If I get the vaccine, am I protecting the people in my household? Am I protecting my coworkers? And then that's something that each of us would want to factor in terms of getting the vaccine or not getting the vaccine. So having that kind of information available to us will be invaluable.
Right, because you kind of hear that already with the flu. Getting a flu shot every year, that you may not necessarily be susceptible to the flu, but there are other people in your family that you might pass it off to who it could have potentially deadly effects to, that you want to get it for not just yourself but for others.
Yeah, and it would be something that we might start to differentiate among the vaccines. Like, these vaccines are comparably protective in terms of illness, but this one has more of an effect rather than this one on you transmit it. And then if you could choose, then you would start to have a reason to discriminate among the vaccines to a greater degree than we do right now.
And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but if the AstraZeneca vaccine does become a success, is that something that would be possible to be available in the United States? I mean, considering that the research was done at Oxford in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, the data will be submitted. Each nation basically runs its own drug approval process. And that means they submit the data that they have to the regulatory agency. In the US, that's the FDA, and the FDA reviews it. Now, in the context of COVID, because of the degree of urgency, we have seen things that don't necessarily yet meet the level of FDA approval that we typically use. But we're using something called an emergency use authorization, where we calibrate the level of risk based on the urgency, the magnitude of the pandemic, to that level of evidence that we have for that particular thing, whether it's a drug or a vaccine. And so they would be scrutinizing the same kinds of study data. The fact that the data was generated here rather than there does not matter. In fact, just as an example, remdesivir, one of the medicines that actually has FDA approval, the key trial was a multi-site trial, and some of the locations for it were outside the U.S. And so, we don't just suddenly draw a border at data. We would really, in fact, we want free flow of data for all countries that are affected. We want to be sharing both what we generate and what's generated elsewhere so that we can all come to an optimal solution to the pandemic.
And you were just talking about that process with the FDA getting the drug or vaccine approved. I know that's a concern that some people have. You hear a lot of people say this was rushed through. I don't feel comfortable taking it just yet. I'm going to take a wait and see approach. What would you want to say to people of that mindset?
So there are two ways to think about how you could rush something. And let's take Usain Bolt for an example. And we could say, well, can we make him run faster, or can we shorten, the length that he's running? If he's actually running faster, he's actually running faster. He's still achieving the same amount. He's doing it in a shorter period of time. What we don't want to see happen is that we move the goalposts or move the finish line, and then you're not really running the race that you claim to be running. So in these cases, one of the ways in which it was expedited was a very vast number of volunteers, so that we could accumulate data in a shorter period of time. And we also allowed a kind of contraction of some of the trials so that there was a little bit more risk to being in the trial. We weren't waiting for sequential stages or phases of trials before we would run the next trial. We would actually go ahead and expand sooner rather than later. That meant that volunteering for the trials offered a little bit more risk, but there were plenty of people who recognized that this was almost a civic duty to participate in these kinds of trials, even with heightened risk. And so what we saw was that the trials were running faster, but they were running as far. The scientific goal line, the standard of evidence that we were looking for, was not altered or decreased. And so, what I would say is these are well proven by current scientific standards. We did not compromise the science to arrive at a conclusion that these are protective. There's firm science behind it by standards that we would use in other years as well. It's just that we expanded the trials, ran them with more people, with more risk for the volunteers, and therefore we're able to generate the data sooner rather than later.
And on the flip side of that, someone might be wondering, they get the shot and they don't feel any different. If they don't feel any different, should they have any concerns that it's actually working?
No, because we saw variations within the volunteers in terms of how they reacted, what symptoms they may or may not experience with the vaccine. So, we're humans, but there's a lot of difference among us. And, some people are having, to the exact same molecule, a different reaction to it. Some people will have those chills and feel ill for the first day, and other people will, hey man, no big deal. So that just reflects normal human variation.
What about women who are pregnant? Should they have any concerns about getting the vaccine while they're pregnant? Should they wait till after they deliver?
So that's a more challenging question. And the WHO, you probably know, has recently sort of weighed in on removing the barrier to pregnancy, trying to balance the clear risks of COVID in pregnancy against I think the relatively lesser degree of information that we have about the vaccine. I would not be able to answer that on a general basis. It really would, as a person, as a woman who's pregnant, is she in a large household? Is she having to work outside the home? Is she having exposures? Can she isolate herself? What's her degree of risk for COVID kind of baseline? And then sort of balancing that against the lesser level of evidence that we have for pregnancy as a recipient for the vaccine. It really has to be decided, probably in consultation with their individual doctor and their OB for their unique life situation. I don't think it can be answered in general.
And once you get your vaccine, are you pretty much free and clear? Is this something that we'll have to do every year?
So those trials were run in, I believe, the year 2020, starting kind of mid-year. So you're asking for me to tell you about how this has demonstrated long-term protection when we aren't even long-term into the trial. As I mentioned, the trials are still ongoing. So we do not know. There is literally no way we could know. What I can tell you is that even in the trials, and I talked about the dramatic protection, this many infections in the placebo, a much lower number of protections in the vaccine arm, it wasn't zero level of clinical disease in the vaccine arm. So the protection as dramatic as it was not perfect, which is true for all vaccines, frankly. And these vaccines are as protective as any vaccine I've ever seen for any other illness in terms of the level of protection. And yet we still saw some infections arise among people who had the vaccine. So we already know that if you get the vaccine, you're clearly not free and clear, because you could be the 5%, not the 95% who actually, get the symptoms of an infection. So no, we're not free and clear. And then we don't know how long even that level of protection will last. And we don't yet know what's the best way to handle that. Should we be measuring antibodies? One reason to think that is that antibodies are typically a measure of protection, but the immune system is far more complex than that. And there's other elements of protection that it provides besides just making antibodies. So it might be that even as antibodies wane, a lot of relevant elements of protection stay in place. We don't know. So part of it will be to continue to follow the participants in the trial, but also people in the real world who get the vaccine and learn from these experiences. We should always be learning. We should think of the healthcare system as a learning healthcare system. It should always be trying to learn more about what it's doing and how well it can do it and improve upon it. And I think that's the approach that people are taking.
I think that's probably a source of some confusion for some people in the public, because you hear sometimes people will say, well, I heard before you said this, and now you're saying that. And so people are like, well, which one is it?
So, if you were to talk to a legal expert, they would say, well, here's what the statute says. And until the statute changes, the statute still says this. But even then, there's an evolution, there's case study, new cases and new Supreme Court decisions. So even in law, and I'm a JD, so that's why I even sort of resort to that, because I try to think about how these two parts of my brain relate to each other. Both of these areas are really subject to new news, new information. There's a reason why interviews like this should continue to take place. We don't just re-air our interview from, say, March of 2020 and say, just go look at the video. There's new stuff coming in all the time, and a responsible public response, a responsible civil response, and a responsible medical response should always be looking at the new information that's coming in. Every conclusion that we hold, we should hold tentatively. We should say what it's based on, but we should also be looking at anything new that's relevant to what we're saying.
And we certainly saw that in the beginning with the issue of wearing masks. First, we were told that we didn't necessarily need to wear a mask, then people should wear a mask, and people were very, I don't know if you'd say confused. Some people might have been confused, and some people weren't happy because people who didn't want to wear a mask thought, well, I thought before you said that I didn't need to wear one. Now you're telling me I do need to wear one. And now we're hearing that, you need to wear more than one. So as you said, that.
Yeah, but one of the things to look at is not just the changing statement, but also, is there anything else changing? So, in the early phases of it, there was next to no, and at some point, zero internally transmitted COVID. And there wasn't yet a scale up in the production of PPE. So there was, a concern that, well, where we're going to encounter is going to be in very isolated, spots. We shouldn't just be mass consuming PPE throughout the nation, because in hotspots like Washington State or California, where we saw early cases, we could basically suck the PPE out of those hotspots at that point, because there wasn't mass production and mass accessibility to it. And it was very unlikely that you were ever at that moment in time going to run into somebody in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks who had COVID. However, that's changed. COVID is now dispersed throughout the United States at high levels, and there is mass produced PPE. And so, those factors are absolutely relevant to what one recommends. And if we are seeing more infectious variants of it, then an extra level of protection, is going to be a response to that changing situation. So it isn't just that the statements change, it's that the situations that are relevant to those recommendations are changing underneath them.
And as you say that, so we know that the variant is here, maybe not necessarily widespread, but it is here in Maryland, or at least one of the variants is. So should we be changing our mask protocol for ourselves?
I think the first and foremost thing is we don't yet even see good, true compliance with masks in all situations anyway. So, the first and foremost thing to message on is if mask wearing should be done, period, when you're out and about outside your home. And it should be over the nose, it should be, over the mouth, and it shouldn't be taken down for anything less than absolute necessity. And you should also be maintaining social distance with it. I think that right now is the larger driver. It's not that we're all wearing masks and we're still having problems because of that. We're not yet even at that level. I do think that people who are in high risk situations A second mask may decrease it, but I would even say, look, we should even be thinking about what mask are we using? How loose are they? Are they really tight fitting, or are they sort of baggy? Are they coming down off our nose? And really, I would prioritize optimizing how we wear a mask right now as more likely to be of impact than adding the second mask. Because really, the statistics that we see are going, at the community level, at the city level, at the state level, are really going to reflect what we're doing as a whole. And as a whole, mask compliance has not been great. It hasn't been what it should be.
One thing that I've wondered is, what are the vaccines actually made out of? And when you go to start doing research on producing a vaccine, like, where do you begin? How do you know in terms of, let's try this, let's try that? Where does that research begin, and what are the vaccines actually made out of?
So they're made out of a variety of things. The newest one, so one of the things that's newsworthy is not just that there's a COVID vaccine, but that the first two, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, were a novel mechanism of producing a vaccine. They were actually a novel approach to the vaccine. And the common denominator to all vaccines is that there should be the presence of some molecule, at least a molecule, within the human body that's part of the infection that you're trying to protect against, so that your immune system can see it, be stimulated against it, and then be prepared to recognize it rapidly and aggressively if it sees it again. That's the common denominator. So the question then is just, how can you produce a molecule or a part of an infection in the human body? Well, one part is and this is the new approach with the Pfizer and the Moderna, is you could actually give the genetic material for a protein, for a part of that virus, so that your body actually uses its own machinery to produce that molecule. And then your immune system can see it as foreign, and gear up against it. Now, in other cases, you just take the protein. You just take the thing from the virus itself. You strip it off, so you're not giving the whole virus. You strip it off, you add it to some things that will stimulate the immune system, and then you inject the molecule itself into the human body and allow the human body to see it, the immune system to see it, and begin to react to it, and then gear up against it. Now, another model is to actually take a weakened version of the infection itself. So we call that a live virus. So another strategy that's been used in other kinds of infections is we're going to create deletions or modifications in the infection so that it's not going to cause illness, not going to cause symptoms, but still be able to put something in. Now, one of the advantages of that is if it's a replicatable, virus or organism, it's going to be generally a bit more of a stimulus to the immune system, because it gives more targets for the immune system to recognize and gear up against. For instance, if I was to put out an APB against a suspect and all I tell you is that they're wearing a black hat, you have less to go on. However, if I can give you, I say, well, it's a black hat, they're this tall, they're wearing this color of gloves and this kind of coat. If I give you more bits of information, all of which you're geared up to recognize and look for, you may be more likely to encounter and find that suspect. So when we give a live virus, we're giving more complexity, more proteins, and there's more things for the immune system to come to recognize and gear up against. When we give just a protein or the genetic material for just one protein, we're creating a narrower target. Now, that's why you have to study it. That may still be sufficient. If you give me that one piece of information about the black hat, I may still find your suspect. And in fact, we've seen that giving just the information about the so-called M spike, the part of the virus that we've been targeting with the vaccines, generates a really strongly protective effect, because that is the outermost part of the virus. So there are a variety of strategies, and these have been, except for the ones that Pfizer and Moderna are using, these other strategies, subunits, where you give the protein itself, or a live but attenuated or weakened virus, those are strategies that have been used for other existing viruses and have been found to be generally safe with very good long-term data, and they're used in other infections.
But with the coronavirus vaccines, they do not contain the virus itself.
So no, we do not have, the first two were these mRNA, just the genetic material for a protein. But I can't say that I can speak categorically about all the trials that are ongoing in terms of what strategies they are employing at this point. I usually, I see the studies when they come out, and then I would be able to comment on them.
Sure. I just know that was a concern, another concern that some people have, that you hear people saying with the flu, that I don't want you are giving me the flu when I get the flu shot. And some people are concerned that you're giving me COVID in order to protect me from COVID.
Well, so what does it mean to give somebody that thing? And the idea is that with these live attenuated viruses, and again, Moderna and Pfizer are not live attenuated viruses. These are, and they're not even a protein stripped off of it. They're the genetic material to make one protein, not even to make the whole virus. But I want to say, I guess I'll say two points, is that even when you're giving a live attenuated, what attenuation means is that you have removed the key parts of that virus that make it, or a bacteria, if it's a bacterial infection and vaccine, that make it cause trouble, right? So you've attenuated, you've weakened it. The other part is that we don't just start doing this in human beings. To even get to the point where it's ethical to run a clinical trial in a human population, you have to supply a fairly substantial amount of what we call preclinical data, and that's data derived from basic science and from animal studies. Where we use analogous organisms, sometimes all the way up to and including primates, to see whether it's in fact safe enough to entertain the possibility of using it in a human population. It's not that we don't yet know it's dangerous, so we can do it. We actually have to have substantial evidence that it's likely to be safe from preclinical animal studies before it's ethical to do it in a human study, and that's highly regulated, and it is part of the layers of safety protection before anything even gets to the general population. But the next layer is that you run a trial, right? You actually do it in human beings who are volunteers, who are informed about the risks, who say, yeah, we don't know yet. We've not done this in humans, but we need to do it in humans. Would you volunteer? And here's why we're doing it. Here's the preclinical data. Here's why we believe it's likely to be safe. But still people get to volunteer, right? And then you find out, and then if it passes that test, which these vaccines have that have made it out, Moderna, Pfizer, were found to be safe in the volunteers. And that's what allowed it to reach a point where it could be released into the general population with heavy evidence of safety as well as efficacy or benefit.
You had a great metaphor using Usain Bolt, and I wonder if that would also apply to people who are wondering, why don't they just create more vaccine? Why do we have these shortages? Why don't they just speed up the production process?
Well, so once you've proven that a particular formula works, like this exact, and you're producing on a small scale, and you're meticulous about how you construct it so that each vial that you give to a different volunteer in the study is exactly the same as what you give to the other volunteer, right? You have absolute control of your production process. Well, but that's easy to do at a small scale, right? When you talk about, well, we need to make it rapidly, we want to be making millions of doses day by day by day, right? Then you have to sort of hand that out to production facilities that are in a variety of locations. And you have to maintain absolute tolerance of the production of it. Now that can be done, but the thing is you want to make sure that it is done. And that means you really want to be sort of focusing on quality control. You want to be looking at batches, making sure that you're not seeing any departures from the way in which it should be constructed. So you want to make sure that the production process is safe. Because if you're producing it in a different way in which you produced it for your study, you can't rely on your data from the study. You're technically producing something different. So you want to be darn sure. It's not like you go and you get a screwdriver and it was badly made that day because the guy went to work drunk. Like, I'm just going to take back the screwdriver, because at this point, this is more important than that. This is not something you can just return the vaccine after it's been injected in you. So you've got to know ahead of time. And so I think that's the major part, is that to scale these things up, they've got to be scaled up so that they are producing exactly what they're supposed to produce, not introducing any impurities into it, so that there's not some widespread problem. And this does go back, this is a lesson that we learned in the mid 20th century when there were some scale-ups of vaccines and there were some impurities in them. So the whole point is to learn from history so you don't repeat history. The idea is that these scale-up production processes have to be perfect. And people are really working hard to make sure that they are, but it will lead to some slowness in terms of our ability to roll them out. But it's for good reason.
Is there one takeaway that you would want people to have from our conversation?
Yeah, what I would say is the studies were done we did not move Usain Bolt's finish line. We really set a level of scientific evidence that we wanted to see for the studies. We set the studies so that they could achieve it sooner rather than later by enrolling more people with more risk to them, so that the demonstration of benefit is scientifically sound, the demonstration of safety is scientifically sound, the amount of benefit is profound in a pandemic that has caused innumerable deaths. And so for me, the recommendation would be to sort of move forward with getting the vaccine and not really quibble over, is it going to be Moderna, is it Pfizer? It's really to get yourself vaccinated as soon as you're eligible to do it. because this is what's really going to move us forward as both a city, as a state, as a nation in terms of getting this under control. We do not have really reliable treatments for COVID, right? We still see, a very high fatality rate among, the folks who get ill with it, and in the order of 10 times worse than flu. So since our tools for treating it are limited and our tools for preventing it are really powerful, we really have to put a premium on prevention right now. And that's masks also.
Keep wearing your mask. I won't say what the governor said.
I would quote the governor, but
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bailey, for joining us this morning and for taking the time to answer all of these questions. We have more information on our website that you can look for. Just go to wmar2news.com/vaccinatingmd. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Bailey, for your time. Everyone, have a great day.